Hi, name's Bret and I'm head of sustainability climate change at Coventry City Council. We're currently under drafting the second strategy, so it's been doing it for some time. So in terms of climate change strategies, Coventry's got a long history of doing work in that area. In the past, it was very focused on carbon emissions and climate change proper. Now it's diversified into a much broader agenda. So it's dealing with things like the consequences of climate change, adaptation, resilience, dealing with things like social economy and all those other issues as well being brought into it. So when we think about local government has a key role to play, you have to think about the spheres of influence, the areas of influence that we have as a local authority. Clearly we have budgets, we can spend money. We work with partner organisations and make things happen. But we also provide services to the public. Many of those have impacts and we have to try and get down our emissions around how we deliver services. We're also a regulator, really important in terms of enforcement activity. So things around how we try and enforce building regs, trying to get the highest standards of energy efficiency, etc. And also in terms of planning policy. So we're currently reviewing the local plan and we think it's pretty weak at the moment in terms of addressing climate change agenda. So we are looking seriously at all the policies within there to try and shape much stricter policies, to try and shape the nature of future development so it's a lot more energy conscious. And also I mentioned about building partnerships. The council can't do any of this on its own. So it's got a key role in terms of being a facilitator, an enabler, working with other organisations, trying to make things happen. So in here we see Margot James, who former Conservative Minister, Digital Culture, now chair of our Independent Climate Change Board. We've got Jimmer Boyle as our councillor, as a Labour councillor, cabinet member. Very important issue. It's seen as apolitical. It's a cross-party thing that needs to be addressed. It's a priority for the council. So we regularly have meetings with all the political parties, all have an interest in this agenda. And in the process of the Climate Change Board, we've got private sector, voluntary sector, and lots of statutory agencies are sitting around the tables, 25 organisations in all. We commissioned a net zero route map for Coventry, which identified where all the impacts were for the city as a whole, not what the council does, but what the city as a whole does. We only account for 1% of emissions as a council. We're only responsible for about 1% of the total emissions. That's quite consistent with other authorities. You went to Glasgow and cities like that, it's very similar. But we also did an analysis of which sectors need to focus on. So transport is very significant. Domestic housing is also a really major. They're the two major ones, really, when you look at it. There's also things about support for businesses, industry, commercial, in terms of trying to deal with energy efficiency, in terms of industrial processes and the like. So when we did the analysis, we could see the breakdown in terms of how we're going to deliver these targets. Coventry's working to the government target of 2050. It's got an interim target for 2030, which is around 68% emissions, reduction. But actually the latter bit is always more difficult to do. The last stuff is the toughest. So really you've got to try and be ahead of the game because you know that the latter stage are going to be a lot more costly, a lot more difficult to do. Another study we did was the Regional Energy Systems Operator. It's a national pilot scheme funded with Innovate UK, which really looked at, analysed energy use across the city, the infrastructure for the city as a whole. So very rare to local authorities to be interested in energy infrastructure. You're seeing a dramatic change over the next few years where local authorities take responsibility for heat networks and things like that. There's a real interest in how is energy managed across the city? How do we, as a city of Coventry, which has an industry with green technology futures, which require zero carbon, how do we have a zero carbon infrastructure and compete well against other areas of the country which might have offshore wind farms right near them, whereas we're in the Midlands don't have access to that. So how do we generate enough renewables within the city, but also how do we get zero carbon from other sources to the city in an efficient way? So I mentioned about local plan, and there's several different facets to that as well. Simple things like doing retrofit. So when I mentioned that list of all the projects, the top 10 in terms of getting a return and reducing carbon emissions, 6 of them related to retrofitting properties. And for Coventry, that is a major problem because we've got a lot of old stock in the city, a lot of solid wall buildings. Exterior wall insulation is a very expensive way of doing it, but it's about the only way for some properties that we have. And we also have to make sure that if we're doing exterior wall insulation, that we get past all the planning concerns about how it affects the exterior of the building and all of that. Lots of local authorities have been having problems with that. As a consequence of that, we've now introduced supplementary planning documents for contractors and developers to use to try and drive that forward as best as possible. We also have a strategic energy partnership with E.ON. We went through a process over a year, 2 years ago, where we did some soft market testing internationally. And we had applications coming from far afield as Japan, Asia, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. But actually, the organization that's based in the city was the one that actually ended up winning through at the end of the day, so it's E.ON. They have 4 strategic sort of themes driving the strategic energy partnership. It's an unusual partnership in that we have not specified everything down to the finest line. What we've asked for is a partner that's willing to work with us to explore solutions to problems. Some of those problems we don't yet know. Some authorities, like Bristol, went down the road of being very prescriptive, and they're now paying the price for it. It's taken them a long time and a lot of money to get where they got to. We did it in about 3 years. They did it in about 12. And we learned from the experiences Nottingham and Bristol and things they did and made sure we didn't make those same mistakes. And it's focused on a number of things. So clean local energy is key. Jobs and skills, and there's a component to this about corporate social responsibility. There's a commitment for the partner to deliver on that. Developing something of innovation and scale. And that's something that is different between ourselves and many others. So we're looking at big scale stuff. It's not just about producing a solar farm for the city, but it's also about the provision of energy infrastructure. And also making sure that there's community benefit, that social benefit, community organisations benefit, etc. So social value figures very strongly in this work, and currently working with a number of schools. There's a project going on at the moment where they're putting solar into 6 secondary schools, working with the schools around that agenda within the curriculum, but linking it directly to the work that's actually going on physically within those schools to work towards net zero. Also for us, if we're going to solve this problem, we're meant to, as a nation, we're meant to be 1.5 homes a minute are meant to be retrofitted. I can tell you this, that's not happening. There's no way that's happening, not at the moment anyway. But for us, there's some major challenges. And the government funds us to do retrofit schemes, but it doesn't fund us to look into the issue about how do we get people to buy into that, or people want to take up grants. And they put so many tight rules on the grants that sometimes people go through a whole load of hoops and then end up not having the funding and having the work done because the time's run out, because the schemes are too short-lived, or the criteria have changed. And it's something we're trying to get round, and it's something we're trying to do an analysis of the city as a whole to understand the different market segments, focus groups, understand what is it that motivates people to do the work. And some interesting things have come out. So we've done a lot of work with Citizen, got a colleague from Citizen here, I've noticed, Adam. We did some work where actually we found out that people's satellite dishes, they thought, when you put exterior wall insulation, we've got to take the satellite dish off, I'm going to lose the telly connection for a while. So that was a deterrent. Actually, Citizen said, no, that's not a problem. we can attach it to the scaffolding while we're doing the work, you still get your reception. That made a difference between a lot of people taking up the service that would not have taken it. So some of these things are really quite subtle that you've got to try and get to grips with to understand. Another one that I dealt with years ago was lofts. We're trying to do loft installation. The biggest barrier to loft installation wasn't having it done. It was like, oh my God, all the stuff I've got in my loft, what am I going to do with it? And then if you say to them, well, actually, if we took it all out for you, store it somewhere, did the work, put it all back, you don't have to do it, we'll do it, would you have it done then? And they say yes. Costs us a few £100 more, but it made the difference between people having it done or not having it done. So it's understanding all those barriers. So it's all those sorts of things, the barriers that prevent people from taking up. So for us, we're trying to understand what those are. Recently, we did a piece of work with a school in Radford where we've been doing some work around retrofit. We had the children involved in designing eco homes. There was a competition. All the parents were involved. They surveyed the parents in the home. The children did use it as part of their research. That gave us some useful insights and information. And then we had a big event at the end where everyone presented, and we presented awards for the best designs. But in the process, we also had conversations with those residents. Many of them were in the private rented sector, which was really helpful to us because that's a major barrier, a major problem for us to try and address. So it gives us insights to understand what those constraints are. Another thing that's really important about this, I used to work in the valleys in South Wales at the time when the pits were closing. So actually, an environmental issue, saving carbon emissions, transforming from coal to gas, but actually witnessed a government that didn't have any idea about how do people who are coal miners transition into jobs or not disadvantaged in the future. We now face a similar challenge for a different group of people. The gas fitters, the car mechanics, all these people are working in industries that are fossil fuel based, they're going to have to shift to either electrical or other basis on looking at green technologies. So we're working on how do we develop skills and help people make that transition. Really fundamental, important piece of work. We're working with Glasgow and London Borough and Newham as well are involved in this sort of work. It's unusual. Coventry is one of the few authorities that's really doing this in a big way, but we're looking at it's really important. If you talk to most car mechanics, many of them are really old. They own the business, and I talk to them and ask them, like, what you're going to do. Well, I'm retiring. I don't need to worry. It won't be a problem for me. But what about all the people you employ? Because some of them might end up becoming, the one that owns that garage and manages that garage. So there's an issue around how do we develop that. Government have recognised that issue. So as a consequence, we're working on the Green Skills Plan. Warwickshire Manufacturing Group, working along with the City Council and the colleges and the other universities, are currently working on a plan that's focusing on some key areas. One is around the automotive sector. The other one is around retrofit in particular, because it's such a big market. And the third one is around recycling of electric goods, which is a real major issue. We've got a very innovative project at the moment called, with Coventry Connects, where we're taking disused laptops, bringing them back into use, wiping the desks, wiping all the disks, and then refurbishing them, and then taking them out to communities where people are digitally excluded. So they actually got free laptops and access. That's funded, that's with NHS, the universities, the City Council, putting in resources. And now we've got companies moving in as well. And we've got funding recently from Hubbub to do that. And what we do is we try and create progression routes for training, really good relationships. Citizen did a lot of work with Westdale, the contractor, who's been brilliant in terms of actually setting up a training establishment in Coventry, actually training people. And as we get someone come through our job shop, pass on, go to the Coventry College, get into a boot camp at Coventry College. We've got specific boot camps about housing retrofit with a Skills to Life boot camp. And then they can either go to Dyson Energy Services, do some work with them, get further training, or Westdale. And then we're ultimately employment. So in Westdale, there's people now earning 30, 40,000 a year doing this sort of work. So actually quite well-paid jobs and really meaningful. We're now looking at further other routes. And NEON are involved as well in terms of looking at that skills development and how they will relate to one another. So I mentioned the 6 secondary schools. That has a tie-in again. While we're doing all that work with the curriculum and everything else, we're also looking at as opportunities for skills. As a real key thing about careers advisors, do they really know what jobs are out there? The other area which is really critical, currently drafting an adaptation resilience plan, which involves a number of organisations. Severn Trent are committing a considerable sum of money towards this as well. But it's looking at we're going to have more floods. We're going to have warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. We're going to have droughts. We're going to have water shortages. We are going to have periods of heat stress with severe concerns around how that's going to affect certain vulnerable people in the city. So how do we manage and plan for that in the future? So that's the work we're currently involved in. And it will look at all sorts of things where, for example, urban greening, where we can sort of cool down the city centres with more planting, use of water, opening up the rivers like the River Sherborne. We've got Project Sherborne at the moment where we're actually deculverting parts of the river. So actually people can see the river. There's very beautiful rivers that flow through the city, but most of them are underground. So we're trying to bring them back to the surface, which is better for wildlife, but also in terms of feeling cooler and helping to cool down the city. All very important things. So we're looking at how to address climate change itself, but also how we're going to adapt to changes we know are going to happen. Thank you.